The scorching African sun cast long shadows across the dusty grounds of the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust's Elephant Orphanage in Nairobi. Within the walls of this sanctuary, dozens of young elephants who had lost their mothers to poaching, drought, or human conflict found hope for a second chance at life. But in the furthest corner of the compound, in a specially constructed enclosure designed for the most vulnerable cases, lay a sight that would break even the hardest heart. Tembo, barely 3 weeks old, was curled into the tightest ball his tiny body could manage. His wrinkled gray skin, which should have been plump with baby fat and good health, hung loose over his fragile frame. The little elephant's eyes, sealed shut by a raging infection that had stolen his sight forever, wept constantly. Thick, yellowish discharge matted the sparse hair around his face, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that spoke of a body giving up its fight for survival. Dr. James Mwangi stood outside the enclosure, his weathered hands gripping the metal bars as he watched the pitiful scene before him. At 52, he had dedicated his entire career to saving African wildlife, but Tembo's case haunted him in ways he had never experienced before. The baby elephant had arrived 5 days earlier, carried in by a team of Kenya Wildlife Service rangers who had found him wandering alone near the carcass of his mother, her face hacked away by poachers desperate for her ivory tusks. The infection in Tembo's eyes had already been severe when he arrived, but despite aggressive antibiotic treatment and round-the-clock care, the damage was irreversible. The veterinary team had managed to save his life, but they could not save his sight. For an elephant whose survival depends heavily on the complex social structures and learned behaviors of the herd, blindness was often a death sentence in the wild. More troubling than his physical condition was Tembo's complete withdrawal from the world. He refused the specially formulated elephant milk that should have been his lifeline, turning his head away whenever the caretakers approached with bottles. He showed no interest in the soft hay placed near his sleeping area, no curiosity about the sounds of other elephants playing in nearby enclosures. It was as if the trauma of losing his mother, combined with his sudden plunge into permanent darkness, had extinguished his will to live. Sarah Muthoni, the head elephant keeper, approached Dr. Sher Mwangi with tears glistening in her eyes. She had been working with orphaned elephants for over 15 years and had successfully raised dozens of babies who had gone on to be released back into the wild. But Tembo's case was unlike anything she had encountered. The little elephant lay on his side, his tiny trunk curled protectively beneath his body. His ribs were becoming more visible each day as he continued to refuse food. The medical team had inserted a feeding tube twice, but Tembo's distress during the procedure was so extreme that they feared the stress might kill him faster than starvation. The sanctuary had tried everything within their considerable expertise. They had played recordings of elephant mothers calling to their young, hoping to trigger some instinctive response. They had introduced him to Shuja, a gentle matriarch elephant who had successfully adopted several orphans, but Tembo showed no interest in her maternal overtures. Even Amara, a playful 2-year-old female who had been successfully integrated into the nursery herd, could not coax any reaction from the blind baby. Dr. Mwangi watched as Samuel, one of the most experienced keepers, entered the enclosure with another bottle of milk. The man moved with infinite patience, speaking in the low, soothing tones that had calmed hundreds of frightened elephants over the years. He knelt beside Tembo's motionless form and gently touched the baby's shoulder. Tembo flinched away from the contact, pressing himself further against the far wall of his shelter. The keeper tried placing the bottle near Tembo's trunk, allowing the scent of the warm milk to waft around the baby's head. In a healthy orphaned elephant, this would typically trigger an immediate feeding response. Tembo's trunk twitched slightly, acknowledging the presence of food, but he made no move to investigate further. After 20 minutes of patient coaxing, Samuel emerged from the enclosure, shaking his head in defeat. Dr. Mwangi called an emergency meeting with the sanctuary's management team. The facts were stark and undeniable. Tembo had been refusing food for nearly a week. His weight loss was becoming critical, and his blood work showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition. The intravenous fluids they had been administering were keeping him alive, but they could not substitute for proper nutrition indefinitely. The room fell silent as Dr. Mwangi presented the medical reports. Everyone present had seen animals in desperate conditions before, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about Tembo's case. Perhaps it was his extreme youth, or the way he seemed to have aged beyond his weeks in his profound sadness. Perhaps it was the knowledge that somewhere in his tiny mind he was still calling for a mother who would never answer. The head of operations, Margaret Kiprotich, spoke the words that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. In cases where an animal showed no will to live, where suffering appeared to outweigh any possibility of recovery, the most humane option was often euthanasia. It was a decision that the sanctuary never made lightly, but one that they had been forced to consider when an animal's quality of life could not be restored. But Dr. Mwangi found himself unable to accept this solution. Something about Tembo called to him, an instinctive feeling that despite all evidence to the contrary, there was still a spark of life buried deep within the baby elephant's despair. He had felt the tiny heart beating strongly when he examined Tembo, had seen the way the baby's ears moved slightly when certain sounds caught his attention. There was intelligence there and awareness, even if it was buried under layers of trauma and grief. He asked for time, just 2 more weeks to try unconventional approaches to explore options that might not be found in any veterinary textbook. The team was reluctant, concerned about prolonging suffering needlessly, but Dr. Mwangi's reputation and years of successful interventions earned him the reprieve he sought. They would give Tembo 14 more days, documenting every attempt at treatment for future reference and learning. As the meeting dispersed and the team returned to their various duties, Dr. Mwangi remained in the conference room, staring out the window at the compound where Tembo lay dying. He had made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, bought time he didn't know how to use. But deep in his heart, he felt certain that Tembo's story wasn't meant to end this way. That evening, as Dr. Mwangi made his rounds through the compound, he stopped by the domestic animal shelter that operated adjacent to the elephant orphanage. The 2 facilities often worked together, sharing resources and expertise, and Dr. Mwangi frequently consulted on cases involving injured wildlife that had been brought to the general shelter by mistake. Tonight, however, he was drawn to the shelter by something else entirely. Word had reached him about a dog that had been brought in the previous day, and something about the animal's story resonated with his current preoccupation with Tembo's case. As he walked through the kennels, he was guided by Mary Wanjiru, the shelter's lead coordinator, to a quiet corner where the special cases were housed. There, lying on a soft blanket in a large, comfortable kennel, was the most magnificent black Labrador Dr. Mwangi had ever seen. The dog's coat gleamed like polished ebony, and his dark eyes held a depth of intelligence and sadness that spoke of experiences far beyond those of an ordinary pet. Despite the trauma that had brought him to the shelter, his tail gave a tentative wag as the humans approached, revealing a spirit that remained unbroken despite his loss. Mary explained that the dog's name was Shadow, and his story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had belonged to David Kimani, a Maasai elder who had worked as a guide for wildlife researchers in the Maasai Mara. Shadow had been David's constant companion for 8 years, accompanying him on countless expeditions into the wilderness, learning to read the subtle signs of animal behavior and developing an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. 3 weeks earlier, David had been killed defending his livestock from a pride of lions that had wandered too close to his boma during the dry season. Shadow had fought alongside his master, sustaining several injuries in the process, but had managed to drive the lions away and save most of the cattle. When David's family found the scene the next morning, they discovered Shadow lying beside his master's body, refusing to leave his side. The family, devastated by their loss and unable to care for David's animals, had brought Shadow to the shelter along with several other dogs. But Shadow was different from the others. While his kennel mates had quickly adapted to shelter life, Shadow remained withdrawn and listless. He ate only when coaxed, showed little interest in the affection offered by volunteers, and spent most of his time lying quietly on his blanket, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. As Dr. Mwangi knelt beside Shadow's kennel, he was struck by the parallel between the dog's condition and Tembo's. Both animals had lost the most important figure in their lives. Both had withdrawn from the world in their grief. Both were slowly fading away, despite receiving excellent physical care. But there was something in Shadow's eyes that gave Dr. Mwangi hope, a gentleness and wisdom that spoke of an animal who understood suffering but had not been broken by it. An idea began to form in Dr. Mwangi's mind, so unconventional and unprecedented that he almost dismissed it immediately. But as he continued to observe Shadow, noting the dog's calm demeanor and the way he seemed to assess every person who approached with careful, intelligent eyes, the idea grew stronger. What if the solution to Tembo's crisis wasn't to be found in veterinary medicine or elephant psychology, but in the simple, profound connection between two grieving souls? The concept was radical, potentially dangerous, and certainly against every protocol the sanctuary had ever followed. Introducing a domestic animal to a traumatized wild elephant could result in injury or death for both creatures. But as Dr. Mwangi looked from Shadow's kennel toward the compound where Tembo lay dying, he found himself wondering if sometimes the most impossible ideas might be the only ones worth trying. He spent the rest of the evening researching, calling colleagues, and trying to convince himself that his plan had any basis in scientific possibility. But as midnight approached and he finally headed home, Dr. Mwangi knew that he had found his answer. Tomorrow, he would begin the most unconventional treatment of his career, one that would either save 2 broken lives or end his reputation forever. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the Kenyan highlands. But Dr. Mwangi had been awake since before sunrise, his mind racing with the details of what he was about to attempt. He had spent most of the night researching interspecies relationships, reading every paper he could find on animal psychology and emotional trauma. While he found numerous examples of unusual animal friendships, nothing in the literature suggested that his plan had any precedent or likelihood of success. Nevertheless, something deep in his gut told him that this was Tembo's only chance. The baby elephant had continued his decline overnight, and the morning report from the night shift painted an increasingly grim picture. Tembo's breathing had become even more labored, and his body temperature was dropping despite the warm blankets the staff had wrapped around him. Dr. Mwangi's first task was to convince his team that his unconventional approach was worth the risk. He called an early morning meeting, gathering Sarah Muthoni and the other senior staff members in the conference room. As he outlined his plan to introduce Shadow to Tembo, he watched their faces cycle through disbelief, concern, and outright horror. Sarah was the first to voice the obvious objections. Elephants were prey animals with deeply ingrained fear responses to predators. Even a domestic dog might trigger panic in a traumatized elephant, potentially causing injury or worsening Tembo's already fragile mental state. Moreover, Shadow, despite his gentle appearance, was still a powerful animal with natural hunting instincts. Placing him in close proximity to a helpless baby elephant could awaken predatory behaviors that might have catastrophic consequences. Dr. Mwangi acknowledged every concern while maintaining his conviction that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. He pointed out that both animals were currently dying slowly from depression and grief. Traditional treatments had failed completely, and without intervention, they would both be gone within days. His plan included multiple safety measures, constant supervision, immediate separation protocols, and the presence of trained staff members who could intervene if either animal showed signs of distress. The debate continued for over an hour, with team members raising valid concerns about liability, safety, and the sanctuary's reputation. But gradually, as Dr. Mwangi shared his observations about Shadow's temperament and his theory about the parallel trauma both animals had experienced, a reluctant consensus began to emerge. They would attempt one carefully controlled introduction with every possible precaution in place. The preparation took most of the morning. They selected a neutral location, a small observation room adjacent to the veterinary clinic that could be completely controlled and monitored. The room was stripped of any objects that could be used as weapons or hiding places, and multiple escape routes were established. Video cameras were installed to document every moment of the interaction for later analysis. Dr. Mwangi personally went to collect Shadow from the shelter, taking time to observe the dog's behavior and assess his readiness for what would be an unprecedented encounter. Shadow seemed to sense that something significant was happening. As they walked through the compound toward the elephant facilities, his ears were alert and his posture attentive, but he showed no signs of fear or aggression. Meanwhile, the elephant care team was preparing Tembo for transport to the observation room. The tiny elephant had to be carried as he was too weak to walk even short distances. As Sarah Muthoni gently lifted his frail body, Tembo made no protest, his head hanging limply as if he had given up any hope of understanding or controlling what happened to him. The observation room fell silent as Dr. Mwangi entered with Shadow. The dog immediately began to explore the space, his nose working to gather information about this new environment. His movements were calm and methodical, showing none of the excitement or nervousness that might indicate potential problems. After a few minutes of investigation, Shadow settled near the center of the room, lying down with his head up and alert, waiting patiently for whatever would happen next. When Sarah entered carrying Tembo, the dynamic in the room shifted immediately. Shadow's body language changed subtly, his posture becoming even more relaxed and submissive. It was as if he instinctively understood that he was in the presence of something vulnerable that required protection rather than pursuit. His tail gave a single gentle wag, but otherwise he remained perfectly still. Sarah placed Tembo on a soft mat in the corner opposite from where Shadow was lying. The baby elephant immediately curled into his characteristic defensive position, his tiny trunk tucked beneath his body and his ears flat against his head. For several minutes, both animals remained motionless, the only sounds in the room being Tembo's labored breathing and the quiet hum of the monitoring equipment. Then Shadow did something that no one expected. Instead of approaching Tembo or even looking directly at him, the dog began to emit a low, almost inaudible sound, somewhere between a whine and a hum. It was not a threatening vocalization, but rather something that sounded almost like a lullaby, a gentle crooning that seemed designed to soothe rather than communicate any specific message. Dr. Mwangi found himself holding his breath as he watched Tembo's response to this unexpected serenade. For the first time since his arrival at the sanctuary, the baby elephant's ears moved forward slightly, swiveling toward the source of the sound. His breathing, while still labored, seemed to become slightly more regular, as if the rhythm of Shadow's vocalizations was helping to calm his respiratory distress. Encouraged by this small response, Shadow continued his gentle singing for several more minutes. Then, with movements so slow and deliberate they seemed almost choreographed, he began to inch forward across the floor. Not directly toward Tembo, but in a wide arc that would bring him closer while maintaining a respectful distance and avoiding any appearance of direct approach or threat. The staff members watching from the observation window were transfixed by what they were seeing. Shadow's behavior defied every assumption they had made about how this encounter might unfold. The dog seemed to understand intuitively that he was in the presence of a creature in profound distress, and every aspect of his body language and behavior was calibrated to communicate safety and comfort. When Shadow had moved to within about 6 feet of Tembo, he stopped and lay down again, this time positioning himself so that his body was parallel to the elephant's, facing the same direction rather than looking at him directly. This positioning, Dr. Mwangi realized, was significant in animal psychology, as direct staring could be interpreted as threatening behavior, while lying parallel suggested companionship rather than confrontation. For nearly an hour, both animals remained in this configuration, with Shadow continuing his soft vocalizations and Tembo gradually relaxing his tightly curled posture. The changes in the elephant's body language were subtle but unmistakable to the trained observers. His breathing became deeper and more regular. His ears moved forward in a position indicating curiosity rather than fear, and most remarkably, his trunk began to uncurl slightly from its defensive position. The breakthrough came when Shadow, perhaps sensing that Tembo was becoming more comfortable with his presence, shifted his position slightly and allowed one paw to extend in the direction of the elephant. He didn't move toward Tembo, but simply made his paw available, an offering of contact that could be accepted or ignored without pressure. Tembo's response was almost miraculous to witness. The baby elephant, who had recoiled from human touch for over a week, slowly and tentatively extended his tiny trunk toward Shadow's outstretched paw. The contact, when it came, was feather-light, just the tip of Tembo's trunk gently touching the soft fur of Shadow's foot. Both animals remained frozen in this position for several minutes, as if afraid that any movement might break the spell. Then Shadow, with infinite gentleness, allowed his paw to shift slightly, providing just enough pressure to let Tembo know that the contact was welcome and reciprocated. Dr. Mwangi felt tears streaming down his face as he watched this first moment of connection between two creatures who had both been lost in their grief. It was more than he had dared to hope for, evidence that his intuition about their compatibility had been correct. But more than that, it was a glimpse of something profound about the nature of healing and the power of companionship to transcend the boundaries between species. The session continued for another hour, with Shadow gradually introducing new elements to their interaction. He would shift position slightly, always telegraphing his movements clearly and giving Tembo time to adjust. He began to make different sounds, soft chuffs and sighs that seemed to create a dialogue with the elephant's own quiet breathing. Most remarkably, Shadow seemed to understand that Tembo's blindness required different forms of communication. Rather than relying on visual cues, he used sound and scent to help the elephant understand his intentions and movements. When he needed to change position, he would make a soft sound first, giving Tembo time to track his location through hearing rather than sight. By the end of the session, Tembo had uncurled completely and was lying in a more natural position, his trunk resting near Shadow's paw and his breathing calm and steady. For the first time since his arrival, the baby elephant looked peaceful rather than anguished. As the staff began to prepare for the session to end, Shadow demonstrated another aspect of his remarkable intuition. Rather than simply getting up and leaving, which might have confused or distressed Tembo, he began to gradually withdraw his paw and shift his position, all while maintaining his gentle vocalizations to reassure the elephant that he wasn't abandoning him, just temporarily moving away. When they finally separated the animals, returning Tembo to his enclosure and Shadow to his kennel, the difference in both creatures was immediately apparent. Shadow's tail wagged continuously as he was led away, his entire demeanor brighter and more alert than it had been since his arrival. And Tembo, incredibly, remained in the relaxed position he had achieved during the session, showing none of the immediate withdrawal and distress that had characterized his behavior after previous handling. That evening, for the first time in over a week, Tembo accepted a small amount of milk from his caretakers. It was not a complete feeding, but it was enough to provide hope that his will to live was beginning to return. Dr. Mwangi knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, the beginning of a bond that would challenge everything they thought they knew about animal behavior and the nature of healing. As he prepared to go home that night, Dr. Mwangi made the decision that would define the next phase of Tembo's recovery. Tomorrow they would begin regular sessions between the elephant and the dog, carefully monitored and gradually extended as the animals became more comfortable with each other. He had no scientific precedent for what he was attempting, but he had something better. Evidence that love and companionship could transcend any barrier, including the species divide that separated a traumatized baby elephant from a grieving Labrador dog. Over the following weeks, the relationship between Tembo and Shadow evolved into something that defied every conventional understanding of interspecies behavior. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save two grieving animals had transformed into a groundbreaking case study in emotional healing and cross-species communication. The daily sessions in the observation room became the cornerstone of both animals' recovery. Each morning, Shadow would enter first, establishing his presence with the same gentle vocalizations that had marked their first encounter. He had developed a complex vocabulary of sounds, each with its own meaning in their private language. A soft woof announced his arrival, a low rumble indicated contentment, and a barely audible whine signaled when he was about to move or change position. Tembo, in response, had begun to develop his own repertoire of communications. His trunk movements had become more expressive, and he had started making small chirping sounds that the elephant care team had never heard from him before. Dr. Mwangi realized that these vocalizations were specifically directed at Shadow, a unique form of communication that the elephant had created for his canine companion. The breakthrough that convinced even the most skeptical staff members came during their third week of sessions. Dr. Mwangi arrived at the observation room to find something unprecedented. Tembo was standing upright, his trunk extended toward Shadow, who was sitting patiently beside a food bowl filled with the specially formulated elephant milk that Tembo had been refusing for weeks. Shadow had somehow understood that Tembo needed guidance to find his food, and had positioned himself to serve as a living landmark. When Tembo's trunk touched Shadow's shoulder, the dog would make a soft sound and shift slightly toward the food bowl, essentially creating an auditory map that the blind elephant could follow. The feeding session that followed was emotional for everyone present. Tembo, guided by Shadow's patient direction, managed to locate and drink nearly half a bottle of milk, more nourishment than he had accepted since his arrival. Shadow remained perfectly still throughout the feeding, understanding instinctively that his role was to provide security and guidance rather than interaction that might distract from the crucial task of eating. As Tembo's physical health began to improve, his personality started to emerge for the first time. The staff discovered that beneath his trauma lay a naturally curious and intelligent young elephant with a playful spirit that had been buried under layers of grief. Shadow seemed to understand this intuitively and gradually began to introduce elements of play into their interactions. The dog would bring small objects into their shared space, toys and balls that he would nudge gently toward Tembo's reach. At first, the elephant showed little interest, but Shadow's persistent and gentle encouragement eventually awakened Tembo's curiosity. The first time the baby elephant picked up a ball with his trunk and tentatively explored its texture, the entire observation team broke into spontaneous applause. Shadow's role as Tembo's guide extended far beyond their formal sessions. Dr. Mwangi arranged for the dog to spend increasing amounts of time in the elephant enclosure, and Shadow quickly established himself as Tembo's eyes and ears in navigating their shared environment. He developed a sophisticated system of warnings and guidance, using different barks and body positions to alert Tembo to obstacles, changes in terrain, or the approach of caretakers. The elephant's mobility improved dramatically under Shadow's guidance. Where Tembo had previously been afraid to move more than a few feet from his sleeping area, he now confidently explored every corner of his enclosure, using Shadow's sounds and scents as reference points to build a mental map of his surroundings. The dog seemed to understand the importance of consistency, always positioning himself in predictable locations and maintaining regular patterns of movement that Tembo could learn and rely upon. Word of the unusual partnership began to spread beyond the sanctuary walls. Wildlife researchers from around the world contacted Dr. Mwangi, seeking to understand the mechanisms behind this remarkable interspecies bond. The video footage from their sessions was studied by animal behaviorists, psychologists, and veterinarians, all attempting to decode the complex communication system that had developed between elephant and dog. Dr. Sarah Bradshaw, a renowned animal psychologist from Oxford University, traveled to Kenya specifically to observe Tembo and Shadow. Her initial skepticism gave way to amazement as she watched their interactions over several days. She documented behaviors that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and emotional capacity. Shadow had developed what Dr. Bradshaw termed empathetic mirroring with Tembo, adjusting his own behavior to complement the elephant's needs and emotional state. On days when Tembo seemed particularly anxious or withdrawn, Shadow would remain closer and increase his comforting vocalizations. When the elephant was feeling playful and energetic, the dog would become more active, engaging in games and exploration that matched Tembo's mood. Perhaps most remarkably, Shadow appeared to have developed a form of surrogate parenting behavior specifically tailored to an elephant's needs. He would position himself beside Tembo during sleep, providing the warmth and security that would normally come from a mother elephant. His presence seemed to regulate Tembo's sleep patterns, and the elephant's nightmares and restless episodes decreased dramatically when Shadow was nearby. The transformation in both animals was remarkable to witness. Tembo grew stronger each day, his weight increasing and his coat developing the healthy sheen that indicated proper nutrition and emotional well-being. His personality blossomed under Shadow's patient guidance, revealing an intelligence and gentleness that endeared him to every member of the sanctuary staff. Shadow, too, seemed to have found his purpose in caring for Tembo. The depression and listlessness that had characterized his early days at the shelter disappeared completely. He approached each day with enthusiasm and energy, clearly taking pride in his role as Tembo's protector and guide. His own physical health improved dramatically, his coat becoming glossy, and his eyes bright with intelligence and contentment. As Tembo grew larger and stronger, the logistics of their partnership required careful planning. The sanctuary constructed a larger enclosure that could accommodate both animals safely, with special features designed to help a blind elephant navigate independently. Raised pathways provided tactile guidance, water features created auditory landmarks, and different ground textures helped Tembo understand his location within the space. Shadow quickly learned to use these environmental modifications to enhance his guidance system. He would lead Tembo to specific textures or sounds that corresponded to different activities, feeding areas, water sources, or resting spots. The dog's intelligence in adapting to these challenges impressed even experienced animal trainers, who noted that Shadow was essentially performing tasks that required abstract thinking and problem-solving abilities rarely seen in domestic animals. The media attention surrounding their story grew exponentially as footage of their interactions spread across social media platforms. News organizations from around the world sent reporters to document the remarkable friendship between the blind baby elephant and his canine guide. The story resonated with audiences globally, inspiring countless people and raising awareness about both elephant conservation and the emotional lives of animals. Dr. Mwangi found himself fielding requests for interviews, documentary appearances, and scientific presentations about the case. While he was initially reluctant to expose Tembo and Shadow to too much attention, he recognized the educational value of their story and the potential for inspiring conservation efforts and research into animal psychology. The sanctuary partnered with several universities to establish a formal research program studying interspecies relationships and emotional healing in traumatized animals. Tembo and Shadow became the flagship case for what would eventually become the Institute for Cross-Species Communication, attracting researchers and funding from around the world. As Tembo approached his first birthday, discussions began about his long-term future. Traditional protocols would eventually require his integration into the sanctuary's elephant herd and preparation for eventual release into the wild. However, his blindness and dependence on Shadow presented unprecedented challenges that required creative solutions. The sanctuary reached out to specialized facilities around the world, seeking a permanent home where both animals could remain together while receiving appropriate care. The response was overwhelming, with zoos, sanctuaries, and private reserves offering to create custom environments for the famous pair. Ultimately, the decision was made to partner with the Amboseli Elephant Research Project, where Dr. Cynthia Moss and her team had been studying elephant behavior for over 40 years. They agreed to establish a special section within their research facility specifically designed for Tembo and Shadow, where the pair could live together while contributing to ongoing research into elephant cognition and interspecies relationships. The transition to their new home was carefully planned over several months. Shadow was gradually introduced to the sights, sounds, and smells of the Amboseli ecosystem, while Tembo was slowly acclimated to the presence of wild elephants at a safe distance. Throughout the process, their bond remained strong, with Shadow continuing to provide security and guidance as Tembo faced new challenges and experiences. On the day of their departure from the orphanage, the entire staff gathered to say goodbye to the pair who had changed their understanding of animal behavior forever. Dr. Mwangi stood beside their transport vehicle, watching as Shadow confidently led Tembo up the ramp, both animals calm and trusting as they faced their next adventure together. At Amboseli, Tembo and Shadow thrived in their new environment. The vast open spaces and natural sounds of the ecosystem provided rich sensory experiences for Tembo, while Shadow's protective presence allowed him to explore with confidence. Their story continued to inspire researchers, conservationists, and animal lovers around the world, proving that the bonds of friendship and love transcend every boundary that separates species. Years passed, and Shadow grew older, his black coat developing silver highlights around his muzzle, and his movements becoming more deliberate with age. But his devotion to Tembo never wavered. As the dog aged, their roles began to shift subtly, with Tembo becoming more protective of his aging companion, using his trunk to steady Shadow when walking became difficult, and sharing his food when the dog's appetite decreased. The full circle of their relationship came when Shadow, now nearly 15 years old, began to experience the vision problems common to aging dogs. As his sight dimmed, Tembo took on the role of guide, using gentle nudges and vocalizations to help his old friend navigate their shared world. It was a beautiful reversal that demonstrated the depth of their bond and the way true friendship adapts to meet changing needs. Their story had evolved from a desperate attempt to save two dying animals into a testament to the power of love, healing, and the remarkable connections that can form between creatures who should, by all conventional wisdom, have nothing in common. Tembo and Shadow had proved that family is not determined by species, but by the willingness to care for another soul with patience, dedication, and unconditional love. In the golden light of an African sunset, visitors to Amboseli could often see them together, the massive gray elephant walking slowly beside his faithful black companion, their friendship a living symbol of hope and healing in a world that often seems divided. Their legacy lived on in the research they had inspired, the conservation efforts they had promoted, and the countless hearts they had touched with their simple, profound demonstration that love knows no boundaries. Dr. Mwangi, now retired but still following their progress from afar, often reflected on the decision that had seemed so impossible all those years ago. In saving Tembo and Shadow, they had discovered something fundamental about the nature of healing and connection, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most extraordinary results. Their story would continue to inspire future generations, a reminder that in our darkest moments, salvation might come from the most unexpected sources, wearing a wagging tail and offering a gentle heart.